Okay, welcome back. This is the continuation of our discussion of the Rwandan genocide. So, remember that at this point in the 90s, the president of Rwanda was Major General Juvenal Habyarimana. Okay, and we said that you know um, he was able to reach a kind of ceasefire and agreement with the rebels, the Tutsi rebels, and he actually signed it with the backing of the UN and the support of the UN, with the idea that UN troops, soldiers would observe, monitor, and if necessary, keep the peace until the agreed upon transition. Power sharing government would be in place. So a government that would be in which there would be power sharing between the two main groups, the Tutsis and the Hutus. And remember that Habyarimana was a Hutu. But I also said in the previous recording that, this power sharing government did not really at this time did not come to fruition. It wasn't realized. Why is that? Because of a tragedy. So in April 1994, as Habyarimana was flying back to Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, along with the president of Burundi, their plane was shot down as it was flying over Kigali. Now, we don't really know until this time, we don't know exactly who fired that missile that shot the plane down. Okay, some people have blamed Hutu extremists, because Habyarimana was a moderate. So I suppose perhaps they had from the point of view of certain people, they would have these Hutu extremists. They would have some kind of interest in eliminating Habyarimana from the picture, and some people blamed the leaders of the Tutsi rebel group, the RPF. So as you can see here, this is a picture of the wreckage. Now, before we continue, let me just say this so that we gain a better understanding of this instance of genocide. Although we call it genocide, it has certain distinguishing features. One, there there was and there is plenty of evidence that this was pre-planned, that Hutu leaders were planning to wipe out the entire Tutsi population from Rwanda. Okay, as early as 1994, January 1994, uh, the Hutus were training for conflict. Okay, and secondly, unlike previous instances of genocide, there was actually evidence of what was happening. Unlike, for instance, the Holocaust, which was kept secret, people knew what was happening when it was happening, when these things were happening. Okay, we're talking about the mid 90s. Okay, so this was in the news. The international community was aware of what was going on. Okay, they were aware of what was about to happen before things started, and they were aware of what was actually unfolding in the country. However, they did nothing. The US did nothing, or they did very little. The UN, at a certain point, told their own troops, you know, don't get involved. If you have to, just defend yourselves. And or maybe some people contributed. For instance, France was supplying the Hutus with weapons because they were allies. Now, moving on. So, within an hour of the plane crash, so these Hutu military groups, they started to organize and carry out mass killings. So we're talking about the presidential guard, the members of the armed forces, the government armed forces, militia groups, more informal groups of people who had access to arms. So, for instance, the infamous um, Interahamwe. So this was a youth group, okay, which was quite involved in carrying out this genocide. So all of these people, they set up roadblocks, barricades, and they started killing Tutsis, all the Tutsis that they could find, or sorry, and Hutus who did not necessarily agree, with their way of thinking or with the course of action that they intended to take. Okay, all of these people were victimized, and something that happened many times. A lot of people tried to escape the violence. They went into churches and they thought they were safe. In some instances, the religious person in the church, had to be convinced by the Hutus, and that person was convinced and gave up. Those people who were hiding in the church, in other cases, there was no convincing necessary. The people hiding were simply handed over to the Hutus and killed within the church or on the grounds of the church. So babies being thrown against walls. People killed on the spot. So really, really horrendous events. So as the genocide began, the first victims were more moderate Hutus in the government, like the prime minister. Unfortunately, once the prime minister was eliminated, this created a political vacuum, and the vacuum was filled by more extreme Hutus. So, people from the military. Belgian peacekeepers were also killed, and as a consequence, the Belgian troops who were in the country, they withdrew. And like I said, the UN peacekeepers, they were told, okay, don't get involved, but you can defend yourselves if, your lives are threatened. So the mass killings in Kigali, in the capital, spread very quickly all across the country. The killers were encouraged by the government. They were given rewards for, eliminating people they perceived to be enemies. They perceived to be other people who were determined to be part of the other ethnic group, and radio stations that were sponsored by the government, they started calling on ordinary civilians to take up arms, and like I said, in many cases machetes, to murder their Tutsi neighbors, to just to exercise violence and contribute to this effort to eliminate the Tutsis from the country. Um, but then the RPF would resume fighting, so you would have a civil war that went on alongside the genocide. So while these things were happening, so you can imagine that some people tried to escape all the violence, so they hid in in rural areas in the woods. They went to other neighboring countries, to Tanzania or the Congo, the Zaire, as it was known at that time. By early July, so we're talking about April to July, roughly 100 days, the RPF would gain control of most of the country. They would win. So they would be able to control Kigali, the capital. And of course, fearing revenge, Hutus would flee the country. More than 2 million of them would try to escape. They would go to the Congo. In some cases, as they tried to escape, they also killed Tutsis in other places. But this would come to an end. The Rwandan genocide would come to an end because the RPF was able to control the country, to win over the government, the Hutu forces. Okay, and so some kind of peace would be achieved. So the RPF established a coalition government. So this was quite comparable to what was originally agreed upon, in Tanzania. Remember that. And Bizimungu would become president. He was a Hutu. And Paul Kagame, who was the leader of the RPF, he would become vice president and at the same time defense minister. So he controlled the military. So effectively, actually, he was the leader. Okay, although um, he would only become president in the year 2000 when Bizimungu resigned. Okay, so Habyarimana's NRMD, that particular party, remember that it was made illegal because of its role in the genocide. By 2003, Rwanda would have a new constitution. Uh, this wouldn't have any reference to ethnicity, so it's actually would actually be outlawed. And later, Kagame would be elected to a 10-year term as president. He's still in power, by the way. And also, the country would have its first ever legislative election. So, Rwanda was on the road to, stability, peace, and as we will see later on, a certain degree of healing, of recovery from, these traumatic events.